The cardboard box felt heavier than it should, weighted not by the few personal effects inside: a worn medical textbook, a framed photo of her graduation, a favorite mug, but by the injustice of it all. Imani Wells pushed open the heavy glass door of Seoul General Hospital, the crisp November air slap against her flushed cheeks. It wasn't just cold, it was indifferent. Just like the disciplinary board. Just like Director Park, with his prim, disapproving stare. Suspended. The word echoed in her head, a flat, ugly sound. Indefinite suspension for gross negligence and failure to follow protocol. Failure. She almost laughed. She and her team had saved 57 people. 57. When the call had come in, a multi-vehicle pileup on the expressway, a catastrophe of twisted metal and shattered glass, the emergency room had descended into controlled chaos. They were overwhelmed within minutes, the roar of sirens a constant, screaming backdrop. There weren't enough beds, not enough plasma, not enough surgeons. Protocol went out the window because protocol was designed for a Tuesday afternoon, not an apocalypse. Imani had made the calls. Triage in the ambulance bay. Converting the physical therapy gym into a makeshift surgical ward. Authorizing the use of a new coagulant agent that was still in its final trial phase, but was the only thing that could stop the catastrophic internal bleeding in a dozen critical patients. She hadn't asked for permission. There wasn't time. She had acted. And every single one of those 12 patients was now stable in the ICU. All 57 victims brought in from the wreckage were alive. It was a miracle, the other nurses had whispered. A record. Director Park had called it recklessness. A lawsuit waiting to happen. An unforgivable breach of conduct. He'd made his decision before she'd even finished her statement. Now she was out. Her keycard deactivated, her locker cleaned out, her career in the city she'd painstakingly tried to make her home hanging by a thread. She shifted the box in her arms, her knuckles white. The automatic doors of the main entrance slid open, and for a moment, the sterile, antiseptic smell of the hospital, a scent that had always meant purpose to her, was replaced by something else. Cedarwood, smoke, and cold, hard currency. A man stood there, flanked by two others in identical, impeccably tailored black suits. He wasn't just standing in the doorway, he was occupying it, his presence altering the very atmosphere of the lobby. The low hum of conversation died. The hurried footsteps of staff slowed. He moved like the room owed him space, and the room paid its debt without question. He was tall, his frame lean but powerful under a dark gray suit that probably cost more than her car. His black hair was expertly cut, every strand in place. But it was his eyes that held her. They were dark, so dark they seemed to absorb the light, and they were fixed on the harried figure of Director Park, who was practically scuttling towards him, bowing his head. Imani recognized him from the gold-framed photograph on the hospital's donor wall. Kwon Ji-han, the owner, the chairman of the entire corporate empire that held Seoul General in its portfolio. She'd heard the whispers, of course, that his business was more than just real estate and tech, that the hospital was a convenient, legitimate place to treat men who acquired injuries in the dead of night. No questions asked. The most dangerous man in Seoul, her landlady had once called him. She clutched her box tighter and tried to sidle past the silent tableau, wanting nothing more than to disappear into the anonymity of the city. But his voice, a low, quiet rumble that cut through the silence, stopped her cold. 57 survivors from a 70-car pileup, Kwon Ji-han said, his tone flat, devoid of emotion. He wasn't looking at Director Park, but at the sprawling chaos of the ER visible through the glass. The news is calling it the miracle on the Han. Explain it to me. Director Park swallowed, adjusting his glasses. A truly remarkable effort from our staff, Chairman Kwon. We were fortunate. I don't believe in fortune. Jihan's gaze finally settled on the administrator, and the temperature in the lobby seemed to drop another 10 degrees. I believe in assets and liabilities. Exceptional results come from exceptional assets. Who was the lead trauma nurse in the ER during the incident? Imani froze, her back to them. Don't say my name. Please, just let me go. Director Park cleared his throat. That would be Nurse Wells. Imani Wells, an American. And where is she? I want to meet the woman responsible for this miracle. A thick, suffocating silence followed. Imani could feel the heat rising in her own neck, the burning shame of it all. She could hear Director Park's fumbling, his desperate attempt to frame his decision as a sound one. Well, Chairman, there was an issue. Several, in fact. While the outcome was positive, her methods were unorthodox. Dangerous. She violated nearly 24 hospital regulations. A serious breach of protocol. To protect the hospital from future liability, I had no choice but to place her on immediate, indefinite suspension. Kwon Jihan didn't speak for a long moment. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, until it was more menacing than any shout. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously soft. You suspended the person who saved 57 lives for saving them. It was not a question. It was a statement of utter disbelief. To protect the hospital's legal standing, sir. The board agreed. I am the board. Jihan cut him off, the words like chips of ice. And you are a fool. His gaze swept the lobby, dismissing the administrator as if he were a piece of furniture. His eyes landed on Imani, on the cardboard box in her arms, on the defiant set of her shoulders. He knew. In that instant, she was certain he knew exactly who she was. That was the moment everything changed. He took a deliberate step towards her, his two guards moving in perfect, silent sync. Director Park sputtered, trying to regain control, but Jihan ignored him completely. He stopped a few feet from her. He didn't look at her face, not at first. His gaze dropped to the box, then to her hands, noting the tremor she couldn't control. Finally, his dark, unreadable eyes met hers. They were intense, analytical, as if he were stripping away every layer of her composure to see the mechanics beneath. Nurse Wells, he said. Her name sounded different in his mouth. Not an accusation, not an identifier. It was a claim. She just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. You're coming with me, he stated, the words an order, not a request. He turned, expecting her to follow, a king leaving his court. Imani found her voice, a strained, raw thing. I've been suspended. I'm supposed to leave the premises. He paused, glancing back at her over his shoulder. A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, or irritation, crossed his features. Director Park has been relieved of his duties. Your suspension has been reviewed. He gestured with his head toward the gleaming black sedan that had just pulled up to the curb, its engine a low, predatory purr. Now, you're coming with me. He didn't take her back into the hospital. The car, a fortress of silent, tinted glass and supple black leather, slid through the congested Seoul traffic with an unnerving ease, other vehicles seeming to melt out of its path. He sat opposite her, not beside her, the space between them charged with a tense, formal distance. He hadn't said a word since she'd gotten in, simply watching her with that same unnerving intensity. He seemed to be taking inventory of her, from the scuff on her practical nursing shoes to the stray curl that had escaped her neat bun. She told herself it was survival instinct that made her watch him back. She noticed the way his hands rested on his knee, perfectly still. Long, elegant fingers, unadorned except for a simple, heavy platinum ring on his right pinky. A faint, almost invisible scar traced a line from his knuckle to his wrist. She noticed the precise cut of his suit, the whisper of expensive fabric when he moved. The scent of cedar and smoke was stronger in the enclosed space, clean and masculine and utterly intimidating. The car descended into a private underground garage and came to a halt before a dedicated elevator. One of his men opened her door. The other already had the elevator waiting. Kwon Jihan led the way, his stride confident and silent on the polished concrete. They rose, the elevator moving with a swift, silent efficiency that spoke of immense wealth. The doors opened directly into a penthouse that was less a home and more a statement. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a breathtaking, panoramic view of the Han River and the glittering cityscape beyond. The space was vast, minimalist, decorated in shades of gray, black, and chrome. It was beautiful and sterile, a gilded cage. Sit, he commanded, gesturing to a low-slung leather sofa. He moved to the wet bar, pouring 2 glasses of water with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. He placed one on the glass table in front of her. I have reviewed your file, he began, taking a seat in an armchair across from her. Imani Wells. top of your class, University of Pennsylvania. Recruited by Seoul General for their new international trauma program. Flawless record. Until today. I did what was necessary, she said, her voice steadier now. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a slow-burning anger. Protocol doesn't account for a war zone. And that's what our ER was. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. 5 years ago, he said, his voice dropping slightly, there was a fire at a textile warehouse in Incheon. A business associate of mine, his wife, was trapped inside. The emergency response was by the book. They followed procedure. They waited for the right equipment. They secured the perimeter. They did everything they were supposed to do. He paused, the silence stretching. She died of smoke inhalation 40 feet from an exit because the fire chief on site refused to send his men into an unstable structure. He followed his protocol. The story hung in the air between them, a ghost of a memory that was clearly more than just an anecdote. It was a wound, the one vulnerability he carried. In that moment, she understood. He wasn't just a businessman reviewing an employee's performance. He saw her actions through the lens of that failure, that loss. He saw the opposite of the man who had let a woman die. His phone buzzed, a discreet, insistent sound. He glanced at the screen, and his entire demeanor shifted. The cool, analytical businessman vanished, replaced by something colder, sharper, lethal. "What is it?" he answered, his Korean clipped and harsh. He listened, his jaw tightening. "Find him. The ward is to be locked down. No one in or out until he is located. Use of force is authorized." He ended the call and stood, his body radiating a new, dangerous energy. "The accident on the expressway," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "It was not an accident. It was an attack by a rival organization. They meant to overwhelm my hospital, create chaos. One of the victims, we admitted, was their assassin. He has just regained consciousness in the ICU, and he has killed his guard." Imani's blood ran cold. The ICU. Her patients. Her colleagues. "I have to go back," Jihan said, his focus already distant, calculating his next move. He walked to a steel panel on the wall, pressing his thumb to it. It slid open to reveal a safe. He pulled out a sleek, black handgun and a spare magazine, checking them with an unnerving familiarity. He then took out a thick stack of currency and tossed it onto the coffee table in front of her. "That is for your trouble," he said, not looking at her. "My driver will take you anywhere you want to go. A hotel, the airport. Disappear. It will be safer for you." She looked at the money, then at him. He was offering her an out, a clean break. The smart choice, the sane choice, would be to take it and run. To forget she ever saw his face, ever stepped into his world. But she thought of the patients in the ICU, vulnerable and unaware. She thought of her friends, the other nurses, walking into a nightmare. She knew that floor better than anyone. She knew the layouts, the access points, the security blind spots. She stood up, pushing the money back across the table. "No." He finally looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his dark eyes. "I'm going with you," Imani said, her voice firm, resolute. "You need me. I know that hospital. I know where he might go, what he might use. You want to find him before he hurts anyone else? You need someone on the inside. That's still me." He studied her for a long, silent moment, his gaze searching for weakness, for fear. She met it head-on, refusing to back down. She was a nurse. Her job was to run toward the danger, not away from it. This was no different. A slow, almost imperceptible nod was his only answer. "Stay behind me," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a condition of her survival. The ride back to the hospital was a descent into a war zone. Jihan was on the phone, issuing a calm, lethal stream of orders in Korean. Men were being moved into position. Exits were being sealed. He was a general commanding his army, and his territory, his hospital, had been invaded. They didn't use the main entrance. The car swept around to a private underground service entry where 2 of his men were waiting, armed with more than just handguns. The air was thick with tension. The hospital, usually a place of managed, healing quiet, was now unnervingly silent. A lockdown. As they moved through the service corridors, Imani's mind raced, plotting the assassin's likely movements. The ICU was on the 5th floor, West Wing. To escape, he'd need a stairwell or an elevator. The main elevators would be shut down. Service elevators? Maybe. But the most direct route was the west stairwell, which exited near the ambulance bay. Fifth floor, she whispered to Jihan, her voice low. He'll be trying to get down. The west stairwell is the fastest way out of that wing. Jihan relayed the information into his phone without breaking stride. He moved with a predatory grace, his weapon held low and ready, his eyes constantly scanning, missing nothing. She found herself matching his pace, her senses on high alert, the adrenaline a familiar fire in her veins. This was a different kind of triage, a different kind of life-saving. They took a secured service elevator up to the 4th floor, planning to take the stairs up to 5 to avoid the main corridors. The elevator was small, the brushed steel walls closing in on them. He stood in front of her, his body a solid shield between her and the doors. She was so close she could feel the heat radiating from him, could smell the faint, clean scent of his skin beneath the expensive cologne. Their eyes met in the reflective surface of the steel doors. A spark of awareness, sharp and unexpected, passed between them. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the low hum of the elevator and the frantic, silent beat of her own heart. The doors opened onto an empty hallway. The lockdown had cleared the floors of all non-essential personnel. It was eerie. They moved toward the stairwell, Jihan in the lead, his steps making no sound on the linoleum floor. He held up a hand, signaling for her to stop as he eased the heavy fire door open a crack. A muffled shout from above, then a gunshot. Sharp, loud, followed by another. Jihan didn't hesitate. He burst through the door and onto the stairwell landing, Imani right behind him. On the flight of stairs above them, 2 of his men were down. The assassin, a gaunt man still in a hospital gown, was rounding the bend to head down toward them, a gun in his hand. He saw Jihan and raised his weapon. Time seemed to warp, to slow down. Imani didn't think. She reacted. The assassin's line of sight was clear. Jihan was exposed. But to her right was a heavy-duty linen cart, left abandoned in the hall. With a surge of adrenaline, she shoved it. Hard. The cart, laden with hundreds of pounds of clean bedding, shot across the polished floor and slammed into the stairwell door just as the assassin fired. The bullet, meant for Jihan's chest, ricocheted off the steel doorframe with a high-pitched scream. The assassin was momentarily stunned by the impact. It was all the opening Jihan needed. He moved with surgical precision, 2 shots from his silenced weapon, so quick they sounded like one. The man crumpled to the stairs, the gun clattering down the concrete steps. Silence descended, broken only by the buzzing of the fluorescent lights. Jihan turned, his weapon still raised, his eyes sweeping the area. They landed on Imani, who was breathing heavily, her hands still braced against the cart. He walked over to her, his expression unreadable. He looked at her, then at the cart, then back at her. The intelligence in his gaze was sharp, assessing. He had been a target, and she had moved to protect him without a second thought. He had almost lost her before he even understood what she was. "You think like I do," he said, his voice a low murmur in the silent hallway. It wasn't praise. It was a statement of fact, a dangerous acknowledgement. You see the whole board, not just the pieces. She looked from the neutralized thread on the stairs to the cold, lethal certainty in his eyes. Her world had tilted on its axis. She was a healer, a saver of lives. But she had just used her knowledge of this place, her instinct, to facilitate violence, to save a man who lived by it. "I told myself I was just trying to get my job back," she confessed, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "That's not true anymore." His eyes held hers, and in their dark depths, she saw not a monster, but a man who understood the brutal calculus of survival. And worse, a man who saw that same understanding in her. The aftermath was a blur of quiet, efficient men in black suits cleaning up the scene. The lockdown was lifted. The story released to the staff was that a distraught patient had attacked a guard and been subdued. No one would question it. Quan Jihan's control over his empire was absolute. He led her to his private office on the top floor of the hospital's administrative tower. It was as stark and controlled as his penthouse, all black lacquer, steel, and glass, overlooking the city he owned. He said nothing, simply watched her as she paced, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving a tremor in its wake. One of his lieutenants, a man named Min, entered without knocking. He spoke in rapid, low Korean, his face grim. He held out a tablet to Jihan. On the screen was a picture of her apartment building, of her front door. On the welcome mat sat a single, potted white orchid, its petals bruised and broken. "The Choi clan," Jihan said, his voice flat and cold. "It's a message. They know who you are. They know you were with me." Imani stared at the image. An orchid. Such a beautiful, delicate thing. "What does it mean?" "It's a symbol," he answered, his eyes like flint. "A debt to be paid in blood. They failed to kill me, so now they will target you to unbalance me, to show me I cannot protect what is mine." The implication hung in the air. What is mine? He saw her not as an employee, not as an ally, but as a possession, a territory to be defended. A part of him recoiled at the thought, at the sheer arrogance of it. But another, deeper part of her, the part that had shoved a linen cart to save his life, the part that had met his gaze in that elevator and felt an unwelcome jolt of connection, understood. In his world, that was the only form of protection that mattered. "You cannot go back to your apartment," he stated. "You will stay with me. My security is absolute." It wasn't a choice. It was a fact. The line she had crossed downstairs was not one she could uncross. She had stepped out of her world and into his, and the gate had just slammed shut behind her. The next few weeks were a strange purgatory. Imani lived in the gilded cage of Jihan's penthouse, a prisoner of his protection. His men were ghosts, silent and ever-present. She had a wardrobe of clothes she hadn't chosen, ate food she hadn't ordered, and lived a life that felt like a dream or a nightmare. Jihan was a constant, unnerving presence. He worked from his home office, taking meetings, issuing orders that moved millions of dollars and ended men's lives with the same detached calm. He rarely spoke to her about personal matters, but she felt his eyes on her constantly. When she read by the window, when she watched the news, when she simply stared out at the city lights. He was studying her, learning her rhythms, her tells. One evening, he found her in the small library, staring at a wall of leather-bound books. "You are restless," he observed. "I'm a nurse," she replied, turning to face him. "I'm used to 12-hour shifts on my feet, to chaos, to purpose. This is just waiting." "You are waiting for the other side to make their move," he corrected her. "So are we. The choice are old-fashioned. They believe in grand gestures. They will not use a simple bullet. They will try to discredit me, to dismantle my honor." He was right. The attack came not with a bomb or a knife, but with a phone call a week later. A high-profile patient in the hospital, a government official with deep ties to Jihan's legitimate businesses, had slipped into a coma. The official cause was an unexpected allergic reaction to a standard antibiotic, an antibiotic that had been administered by a new floating nurse on the VIP ward, a nurse whose temporary credentials had been signed off, remotely, by Dr. Imani Wells. It was a perfect trap. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. Her name, her authority, used to poison one of Jihan's most important allies. The Choi clan had leaked the story to a friendly journalist. The police would be forced to open an investigation. Jihan would be faced with an impossible choice: hand her over to the authorities, showing weakness and sacrificing a key piece, or protect her and look like he was covering up a criminal act within his own hospital, shattering his public legitimacy. A meeting was called, not with the police, but with the head of the Choi family. A summit on neutral ground, the hospital boardroom. Imani insisted on being there. "This is about me," she told Jihan, her voice shaking with rage. "They used my name. I will not hide while you decide my fate." He studied her, a flicker of something that might have been respect in his eyes. "Very well," he said. "But you will not speak unless I tell you to." The boardroom was cold, the long mahogany table a battlefield. Choi Jinwoo, the patriarch of the rival clan, sat opposite them, flanked by his sons. He was an older man with a deceptively gentle smile. "Chairman Kwan," Choi began, his voice smooth as silk.
"Un tragique accident.
"It reflects poorly on the standards of your facility. To have such a catastrophic error occur. The public will demand accountability." Jihan remained silent, his hands steepled before him, his face a mask of stone. Choi's eyes slid to Imani. The nurse responsible. Wells. A foreigner. Perhaps she was not properly trained in our procedures. It would be best for everyone if she were to cooperate fully with the authorities. It would show that you, Chairman Kwan, are a man who values justice above personal loyalty. This was it. The move. He was offering Jihan a way out that would simultaneously cripple him. Imani's heart hammered against her ribs. Jihan had told her not to speak, but she was not one of his soldiers. She was not a pawn to be sacrificed. She looked at the file on the table in front of them, the patient's doctored chart. She had spent the last 24 hours memorizing every line of it. She pushed her chair back and stood up. Jihan's head snapped toward her, his eyes flashing a warning. She ignored it. The patient wasn't given a standard antibiotic, Imani said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with the authority of her profession. Every eye in the room fixed on her. The chart says cefazolin, but the reaction described rapid onset respiratory paralysis, pinpoint pupils, bradycardia. That's not an allergic reaction. That's organophosphate poisoning. She leaned forward, placing her hands on the table. It's a nerve agent. Difficult to trace unless you know what to look for. It can be administered in a saline drip and is often mistaken for an anaphylactic shock in a clinical setting. But it has one unique side effect. She looked directly at Choi Jinwoo. It causes profuse, uncontrolled sweating. I'd be willing to bet the patient's bed sheets had to be changed multiple times in the first hour. Sheets which I'm sure the compromised nurse on your payroll disposed of. But the initial paramedics report will mention it. Diaphoresis. It will be in the intake notes. A dead silence fell over the room. Choi's gentle smile had vanished. She had not only identified the frame-up, she had named the method, a chemical signature known to be favored by his more unsavory enforcers. She had taken their precise, surgical attack and turned it into a clumsy, traceable crime. That's when Jihan moved. He didn't speak. He rose from his chair, walked the length of the table, and came to stand directly behind her. He placed a heavy, possessive hand on her shoulder. It was a brand, a declaration. He looked across the table at Choi Jinwoo, his voice low and final. "This hospital is mine," he said, the words dropping like stones into a deep well. "Dr. Imani Wells is mine. Any move against her is a move against me." His eyes narrowed, becoming chips of black ice. The debt for the orchid on her door is now due. It was the signal. The doors to the boardroom burst open, and Jihan's men, led by Min, flooded the room. The Choice were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and utterly defeated. The fragile peace was shattered. A war had begun. But standing there, with the solid weight of Jihan's hand on her shoulder, Imani felt not fear, but a strange, terrifying sense of belonging. Weeks later, the city was different. The war was a quiet, brutal thing fought in the shadows, but its tremors were felt everywhere. Imani was no longer just a nurse and no longer a prisoner. She was something else entirely, something she hadn't yet put a name to. She stood on the penthouse balcony, the city lights a river of diamonds below. She wasn't wearing scrubs or borrowed clothes. She wore a simple black dress, elegant and severe. It felt like a uniform for her new life. She heard him approach, felt his presence before he spoke. He came to stand behind her, not touching, but so close she could feel the warmth of his body shielding her from the night wind. He didn't offer apologies or declarations of love. Such words were meaningless in his world. He dealt in truths. "They will never stop coming for me," he said, his voice a low rumble against the vast silence of the night. It was a promise, a warning, a life sentence. She didn't turn. She didn't flinch. She watched their two reflections in the dark glass of the window, her, still and resolute, him, a powerful shadow at her back, his eyes fixed only on her. "Let them come," she said. The choice was made, not for a job, not for survival, but for the man who saw the warrior and the healer, and for the woman who was no longer afraid of the darkness, because she had found a king who reigned there.